On a frigid March morning in 2024, New York authorities received a call about an unusual situation at a luxurious Upper East Side apartment. What awaited them inside would not only shock the city, but ripple across continents, shaking a family in Mumbai to its core. Ananya Mehra, a 19-year-old computer science student at Columbia University, was found dead under circumstances that initially seemed like a tragic accident. Her final social media post, just 2 days prior, showed her smiling in a sleek midtown restaurant, adorned in a designer dress far beyond the reach of her modest scholarship. The caption read, "Living the Dream," a statement that masked the reality beneath her carefully curated image. Ananya's arrival in the United States in August 2023 had been filled with promise. The daughter of Rajiv Mehra, a public school teacher, and Dr. Shalini Mehra, a nurse, she had won a partial scholarship to Columbia and became the first in her family to study abroad. She carried not only her own ambitions, but also the hopes of an entire community that had invested in her future. Ananya always said she wanted to do something big in America, Rajiv recalled in an emotional video call from Mumbai. "We never imagined it would be headlines like this." Her first months in New York mirrored the excitement she had imagined. Her grades were excellent, and she became an active member of the university's programming club. She formed close friendships with fellow international students and shared her excitement over video calls home, describing inspiring professors, campus life, and the endless possibilities the city offered. Yet behind this enthusiastic exterior, financial stress quietly grew. Despite her scholarship, the cost of living in Manhattan was crushing. Rent for her small Harlem room consumed a significant portion of her allowance, while books, food, transportation, and winter clothing quickly drained the remainder. Simran Joshi, her roommate, remembers Ananya casually mentioning how expensive life was, yet always brushing it off. Pride and independence prevented her from worrying her family. To manage, Ananya began working part-time at a campus coffee shop, permitted under her student visa. Even so, her income barely covered essentials. Meanwhile, classmates from wealthier backgrounds seemed to glide through life effortlessly, attending upscale dinners, weekend trips, and designer stores. Ananya's growing sense of isolation made her increasingly vulnerable, a vulnerability that would soon draw the attention of a man who seemed to appear at exactly the right moment. It was a crisp October afternoon when Ananya's life took an unexpected turn. Sitting in the university library, she struggled with her aging laptop during a critical programming session. Frustration mounted, tears threatened, and with no money to replace or repair the device, she felt cornered. That's when Jonathan Hartman appeared, a sharply dressed man in his mid-40s who seemed to have stepped out of a business magazine. "Excuse me, I noticed you're having trouble with your laptop," he said, introducing himself with effortless charm. Jonathan claimed to be a tech entrepreneur, offering immediate help and insisting she needn't pay a single cent, consider it a small contribution to education, he said with a warm, fatherly smile. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a generous act. Jonathan took her laptop to a trusted repair shop and had it fixed the same day, something that normally would have taken a week. For Ananya, exhausted and overwhelmed by New York's demands, he appeared to be a lifeline. But this was only the beginning. Jonathan's gestures, though framed as mentorship, were the first calculated steps in a much darker plan. In the weeks that followed, he began weaving himself more deeply into her daily life. A congratulatory message on Instagram, a coffee invitation at a stylish Upper West Side cafe, a casual conversation about career ambitions. All of it seemed innocuous, almost flattering. Jonathan presented himself as a mentor who understood the pressures faced by young international students and spoke eloquently about opportunities, internships, and connections in the tech world. Ananya, starved for guidance in a foreign city and struggling financially, was drawn in. "Jonathan actually seemed interested in my future," Ananya told her friend Lena Kapoor weeks later. "Not like other guys who just want one thing. He really seemed to know my field, my projects. He asked questions that mattered. And he never pressured her romantically at first. Jonathan built trust methodically, alternating between encouragement and subtle suggestions that others, her peers, even professors, couldn't truly recognize her potential. By November, their encounters had become more frequent, always in public and seemingly respectable locations. upscale restaurants, art galleries, tech networking events. Jonathan introduced Ananya to a world she had never imagined, a world of elegance, exclusivity, and influence. Dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, invitations to private events, introductions to young entrepreneurs who could accelerate her career. For a student from a middle-class family in Mumbai, this universe was dazzling and disorienting. Jonathan's tactics were precise. He praised Ananya's intelligence and ambition while subtly fostering dependency. He suggested that only someone with his insight could fully recognize her value. Each gift, a new winter coat, a high-end gadget, even money for textbooks, was framed as an investment in her future but carried an unspoken obligation. Simran Joshi recalls, she came home excited, talking about who she'd met and what opportunities were coming, and it was always, Jonathan suggested this, or Jonathan introduced me. Slowly, Jonathan was shaping a world where Ananya's independence and judgment became intertwined with his control. By the end of 2023, what had begun as occasional mentorship had evolved into a subtle, pervasive manipulation, with Ananya increasingly isolated from her friends and financially dependent. The first seeds of a dangerous pattern had been sown. By December 2023, Jonathan Hartman's influence over Ananya had intensified. What had started as mentorship now extended into nearly every aspect of her life. He began offering increasingly lavish gifts, each carefully justified as necessary for her success. A new iPhone, because a tech student deserves the best tools. An elegant winter coat, so you don't freeze in New York. Money for textbooks, an investment in your bright future. Every gift carried a paternal smile and a subtle emotional charge. Ananya felt special, yet unknowingly indebted. Simran Joshi noticed the change. Ananya seemed happier, yet simultaneously more withdrawn from her friends, less willing to explain her new lifestyle. The real turning point came in January 2024. During a dinner at a chic Italian restaurant in Soho, Jonathan casually offered her the use of a luxurious Upper East Side apartment. "I've been watching how cramped your Harlem room is," he said, his tone seemingly considerate. "This apartment is available, full security, close to campus. It would make studying so much easier." Ananya hesitated, aware of the exorbitant cost, but Jonathan waved off her concern. "Don't worry about rent. Consider it part of the mentoring program. Young talent flourishes best in the right environment." The apartment was a dream. Spacious, modern, with a breathtaking view of Central Park. It felt like a palace compared to her Harlem room. Jonathan oversaw every detail. Furniture, decor, even a new wardrobe for professional networking events. Ananya's life seemed transformed overnight. But along with the luxury came subtle instructions that isolated her from old support systems. Jonathan suggested she devote herself entirely to real opportunities and minimize contact with friends who didn't understand her ambitions. Suddenly, she was always busy, Simran Joshi recalls. Every week, there was some event Jonathan had arranged. She stopped joining our usual gatherings, always with a new excuse. Jonathan also insisted on secrecy, framing it as professional discretion. "You don't want your parents to worry," he explained. "They might not understand how networking works in the US. It's better to spare them the confusion." By February 2024, Jonathan's mentorship had evolved into something more personal and manipulative. During an evening at his Tribeca penthouse, he made the first direct suggestion of intimacy. Ananya, shocked and hesitant, immediately recognized the shift. Jonathan did not pressure her physically, but emotionally, he carefully framed the proposition as a mutually beneficial relationship, one that allowed her to continue her studies while receiving his support. He reinforced her dependence, gradually blurring boundaries between mentorship, friendship, and coercion. The stage was set for a deeper entanglement. Ananya's social circle shrank, her reliance on Jonathan grew, and he established subtle systems of control, emotional rewards and punishments, expectations of availability, and even surveillance disguised as concern. Security apps on her phone allowed him to track her location, monitor her communications, and maintain influence over her every decision, all under the guise of protection. Financially, he escalated the control. By March, Jonathan was providing regular allowances, initially $2,000 per week, then $3,500, with strict conditions about appearance, clothing, and behavior. Resistance or attempts to assert independence were met with disappointment or suspension of financial support. The money, while tempting to a student struggling in New York, was a carefully constructed tool of manipulation. Ananya was now completely enmeshed in Jonathan Hartman's carefully orchestrated world. Friends and family noticed changes, but she had become adept at deflecting questions. When asked about her expensive clothing or her improved living situation during video calls home, she attributed it to scholarships and freelance opportunities. Even her professors noticed. Her grades were strong, but she seemed distracted, said Professor James Mitchell. She always said she was exploring networking opportunities, but I could tell something was off. By early March 2024, Ananya Mehra had settled into her new life, but cracks were beginning to appear. While the Upper East Side apartment and lavish gifts seemed like a dream, they masked a carefully orchestrated trap. Jonathan Hartman's influence extended beyond mentorship and generosity. He had created a system of psychological control that left Ananya increasingly isolated from friends and emotionally dependent on him. Although subtle at first, the signs became harder to ignore. Jonathan insisted on secrecy, framing it as a necessary professional precaution. Ananya was told to keep details of their meetings private, especially from her family in India, so they don't worry unnecessarily. Friends like Leena Kapoor and Simran Joshi noticed the growing distance. Simran recalls, she stopped calling, stopped visiting. She was always busy with some important event Jonathan had arranged. Even casual social interactions became excuses for avoiding friends and family. Jonathan's manipulation extended to emotional rewards and punishments. He praised Ananya for her intelligence and ambition, making her feel exceptional, while subtly suggesting that only he could fully appreciate her worth. When she faltered or questioned his guidance, he withdrew attention or implied disappointment, reinforcing dependence. Every gift, every opportunity, and even the apartment itself came with invisible strings that tightened over time. The financial control was just as sophisticated. Jonathan initially offered allowances to cover expenses, framing it as recognition for her talent. Yet he dictated how the money should be spent, specific clothes, salons, and appearances that met his approval. Resistance was met with emotional withdrawal or a reduction in support. She started mentioning that Jonathan got upset if she wasn't available. Recalled Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, a mental health counselor Ananya briefly consulted in March. These are classic signs of psychological manipulation. Then, in mid-March, a seemingly minor mistake by Jonathan changed everything. He accidentally left his laptop in Ananya's apartment after a routine evening visit. Initially, she intended only to return it, but a notification on the screen caught her attention, a message from a young woman saying, "I need to talk about the money you owe me." Curious and uneasy, Ananya opened Jonathan's laptop. What she discovered sent chills down her spine. Inside a meticulously organized folder titled Special Projects were records of multiple young women, all international students, who had been manipulated in nearly identical ways. Photos, financial records, text conversations, and even intimate videos detailed the systematic exploitation of at least 7 victims over the past 3 years. Each had been lured under the guise of mentorship, offered gifts and apartments, isolated from support networks, and gradually coerced into intimate arrangements. It was like reading about my own life, but multiplied by 7. Ananya confided to Leena Kapoor during a frantic call. She realized the horrifying pattern she was now part of. Jonathan's manipulations were neither isolated nor accidental. She was one victim in a carefully designed network of control. Even more disturbing were hints about the fate of others. Some had disappeared after confronting Jonathan, while records suggested others had been coerced into silence with threats and blackmail. One folder contained documents about Anastasia Volkov, a 20-year-old Russian student found dead 6 months earlier. Officially deemed an accidental overdose, Jonathan's files suggested otherwise, including photos of her unconscious and references to experimental drug dosages. Ananya now faced a terrifying reality. She was entangled in a predator's systematic operation, where financial dependency, emotional control, isolation, and blackmail had been perfected over years. Her next choices would determine not just her future, but her very survival. After discovering the full extent of Jonathan Hartman's manipulations, Ananya Mehra spent 2 days in stunned silence, grappling with fear, anger, and disbelief. She faced impossible choices: contact the police, warn the other victims, flee home to India, or confront Jonathan directly. Each option carried enormous risk. Jonathan had carefully constructed his identity, presenting himself as a respected mentor and wealthy entrepreneur, and Ananya knew that legally, it would be her word against his. Despite the danger, Ananya's resolve hardened. She could not live knowing other young women would fall prey to the same manipulative web. On the night of March 17th, she called her closest friend, Lena Kapoor. "I've discovered terrible things about Jonathan," she said, her voice trembling yet determined. "I'm going to confront him. I can't let anyone else go through this." Lena pleaded with her to reconsider, warning of the risks, but Ananya had made up her mind. She spent the night meticulously preparing, documenting evidence, securing copies of Jonathan's files, and secretly sending backup to Lena as a safeguard. The following afternoon, March 18th, 2024, Ananya arrived at Jonathan's Tribeca penthouse at 3:30 p.m. Surveillance cameras later confirmed her calm, deliberate demeanor as she entered the building. The apartment, lavish and intimidating, had been the stage for months of subtle psychological control. Over the next 3 hours, the confrontation escalated rapidly. Initially, Jonathan attempted denial and minimization. He dismissed her accusations as misunderstandings, claiming the files and messages were misinterpreted. But Ananya was prepared. She presented evidence from his laptop, recordings, and documents detailing the exploitation of other victims, including Anastasia Volkov. Jonathan's confident facade began to crack. His tone shifted, becoming cold and threatening. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he warned. "I have connections you can't even imagine. I can make life very difficult for you and your family." Ananya stood firm, refusing to back down. She demanded that he end his manipulations and release the other victims from his control. This defiance shattered the psychological grip Jonathan had always maintained over his targets. What had been a carefully orchestrated web of emotional manipulation, financial dependency, and isolation now faced the full force of Ananya's courage and determination. However, her bravery placed her in immediate danger. Jonathan, recognizing he had lost control, escalated to violence. Forensic evidence later revealed signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, broken glass, and chemicals prepared for administration. Jonathan had syringes containing a lethal mix of synthetic drugs intended to mimic accidental overdoses of stressed students, his method for covering his crimes. Ananya's last moments were marked by terror and defiance. Recordings on her phone captured her voice weakening under the drugs, yet still bargaining for her life. "Please, Jonathan, my family, they don't know where I am," she whispered. Jonathan carried her, determined to stage another fatal accident. But fate intervened. Something went wrong. Perhaps the excessive dosage, perhaps her resistance, or perhaps the accumulated consequences of his own actions. By 9:45 p.m., when Jonathan returned Ananya to her Upper East Side apartment, she was already dead. For the first time, the predator's meticulous system had failed, leaving sufficient evidence behind for the truth to eventually surface. On the morning of March 19th, 2024, at 7:43 a.m., an anonymous call to 911 reported a possible overdose at an Upper East Side apartment. What initially appeared to be another tragic case of a stressed international student quickly raised suspicions. Detective Michael Torres, a 15-year NYPD veteran specializing in crimes against vulnerable youth, was assigned to the case. At first glance, the scenario seemed familiar: a young student, financial pressures, substances in her system. But something felt off. The apartment itself raised immediate questions. It was far too luxurious for a student supposedly struggling financially. Expensive clothing filled the closet, and subtle signs suggested someone had attempted to tidy up the scene before authorities arrived. Detective Torres recalls, it didn't match the story of a financially stressed student. There were details that didn't add up. The autopsy revealed a lethal mixture of synthetic fentanyl and ketamine, substances Ananya had never used before. Injection marks indicated forced administration rather than self-injection. Dr. Sarah Kim, the medical examiner, explained that the positioning of the body suggested it had been moved post-mortem. Normally, a voluntary overdose results in a specific body posture, which was absent here. Investigators also noted evidence of industrial cleaning chemicals used on surfaces consistent with attempts to erase traces of the crime. The most significant breakthrough came with the discovery of Ananya's phone hidden under her mattress. Normally, she kept it close at hand, making its unusual location suspicious. More importantly, the device contained audio recordings she had secretly made in the days leading up to her death. These recordings captured conversations with Jonathan Hartman, including direct threats and evidence of blackmail. However, attempts to locate Jonathan at the address Ananya had provided revealed a chilling truth. No such person lived there. The identity she had trusted was entirely fabricated. Detectives realized they were dealing with someone far more sophisticated and dangerous than a simple manipulator. Through careful analysis of security cameras, financial records, and cross-referencing multiple identities, authorities uncovered Jonathan's true identity, David Chinmorrison, a 47-year-old man with a criminal history and a disturbing psychological profile. Growing up in a dysfunctional family in Queens, David had suffered abuse at the hands of an uncle later revealed to be a serial predator himself. Psychologists explained that this history had contributed to a complex cycle of victimization and predation, shaping his ability to manipulate vulnerable individuals with precision. As the investigation deepened, detectives discovered that David operated a sophisticated international network disguised as a mentorship program for bright young students. He had accomplices in at least 7 countries, including South Korea, India, Brazil, Nigeria, and Ukraine. The operation systematically targeted middle-class students from developing countries, recruiting them with promises of financial support, mentorship, and career opportunities, only to trap them in cycles of coercion, isolation, and exploitation. By the time authorities began unraveling this network, it became clear that Ananya was just one of at least 23 known victims over the past 5 years. Each had been manipulated through the same pattern: initial trust, financial dependency, emotional control, isolation, and, in some cases, blackmail. The investigation revealed not only the scale of David's crimes, but also the chilling precision with which he orchestrated them. As the investigation into David Chinmorrison unfolded, authorities began piecing together the horrifying scope of his operations. What had initially seemed like isolated cases of manipulation and coercion now revealed a meticulously constructed international network of sexual exploitation and psychological control. David's methods were disturbingly consistent, targeting bright, young international students from middle-class families in developing countries who were pursuing education in the United States. Detectives discovered that the scheme began long before students even arrived in America. Recruiters in various countries identified promising young women, offering free consulting on university applications and even covering application fees. Once the students were admitted and arrived in the U.S., David, or one of his associates, would establish contact, always under false identities as successful businessmen or investors. Their approach was methodical: initial trust, assistance with problems, financial generosity, and gradual isolation from friends and family. Each victim was drawn into a relationship that blurred professional mentorship with personal dependency, making resistance psychologically and financially difficult. The files recovered from Jonathan's laptop revealed at least 7 students manipulated in exactly the same pattern as Ananya. Photos, text conversations, financial records, and even secretly recorded intimate videos. 2 of the previous victims had disappeared after attempting to confront David. One had supposedly returned home due to a family emergency, and another had transferred to a West Coast university, but the records suggested far more sinister outcomes. In text exchanges with unidentified associates, David casually discussed methods to handle victims who became problematic, using phrases like permanent solutions and necessary cleanups. One particularly shocking file concerned Anastasia Volkov, a 20-year-old Russian student who had died 6 months earlier. Her death had been ruled an accidental overdose, but David's files contained images of her unconscious and references to experimental drug administration. The meticulous documentation revealed that her death had likely been orchestrated to appear accidental, following the same pattern David had intended for Ananya. Beyond physical threats, David's psychological manipulation was enhanced through surveillance. Hidden cameras in the apartments of his victims recorded private moments, including phone conversations with family, expressions of distress, and intimate acts. These recordings were systematically used as blackmail, ensuring compliance. Any attempt to expose him would trigger threats of public humiliation, jeopardizing their family's honor, educational opportunities, and professional futures. Detective Michael Torres later explained, he specifically targeted young women from conservative cultures, where the fear of shame made escape nearly impossible. It was an almost inescapable psychological prison. Ananya's own discovery of this system intensified the danger she faced. She realized she was not merely an isolated victim. She was part of a carefully constructed chain of manipulation, coercion, and blackmail, with a history of prior victims whose fates ranged from silence to death. The revelation weighed heavily on her, yet it also strengthened her resolve to confront David, even as the risks became overwhelmingly clear. The files left no room for doubt. David Morrison was not a single-time predator acting impulsively. He was a calculating professional who had honed his methods over years, creating an international network of exploitation with terrifying efficiency. Ananya's courage in facing him directly, armed with evidence, would set in motion the final, fatal confrontation. Following Ananya Mehra's tragic death, the investigation into David Morrison intensified. With her recordings, laptop evidence, and the meticulous documentation left behind, authorities began to unravel the full magnitude of his crimes. The details were harrowing, an international web of exploitation, manipulation, and blackmail that had preyed on at least 23 young women over 5 years. Each victim had been ensnared using the same formula: trust, financial support, isolation, surveillance, and coercion, culminating in devastating psychological and, in some cases, physical harm. Detective Michael Torres, reflecting on the case, described the chilling efficiency of David's operation. He wasn't acting impulsively. He understood vulnerabilities, especially those of young women far from home, and he exploited them systematically. This was a calculated, professional criminal network. His partners in multiple countries enabled the scheme to reach across continents, targeting students in South Korea, India, Brazil, Nigeria, and Ukraine, ensuring a steady flow of victims under the guise of mentorship and opportunity. The investigation also revealed the psychological sophistication of David's manipulation. Through lavish gifts, control over living arrangements, emotional dependency, and constant surveillance, he maintained a grip on his victims' lives. Hidden cameras, secret recordings, and intimate documentation were all used as instruments of fear and control, leaving victims feeling trapped and powerless. The scale of the operation demonstrated both the cruelty and meticulous planning behind each interaction, each promise, and each threat. Ananya's courage, however, was not in vain. Though she lost her life confronting David, the evidence she had collected became the cornerstone for dismantling his network. Authorities were able to track down associates, identify additional victims, and begin legal proceedings against David and his collaborators. Her recordings, meticulous documentation, and clear-minded defiance provided critical proof of a pattern of crimes that had previously gone undetected. The aftermath left a lasting impact on those who knew her. Rajiv and Shalini Mehra, grieving in Mumbai, struggled with the unimaginable truth that their daughter's bright future had been cut short by a predator operating across borders. Friends like Leena Kapoor and Simran Joshi grappled with guilt and sorrow, but also pride in Ananya's bravery and integrity. Professor James Mitchell, who had noticed the changes in Ananya, remarked, "She was bright, talented, and determined. It's a tragedy that such brilliance was exploited, but her courage ensured that the truth came to light." David Morrison's arrest marked a turning point. Once a man operating with near-total impunity, he faced the consequences of a lifetime of calculated exploitation. Yet the case also exposed the vulnerabilities of young international students, the dangers of unchecked mentorship, and the devastating power of financial and emotional manipulation. Ananya Mehra's story remains a stark reminder of both human vulnerability and resilience. While the tragedy cannot be undone, her actions ensured that future victims might be spared the fate she endured. Her life, though brief, became a catalyst for justice, a testament to courage in the face of unimaginable danger.